The Asian century, it's a phrase we hear more and more these days. Is it hype, or is there actually something bigger happening, something on the horizon?
Yeah.
We decided to really dig into this idea with this book, Cold War 2.0, Dawn of the Asian Millennium by Andranik Aghazarian.
Hmm.
And I have to say, it gave us a lot to think about.
Fascinating look at what's going on in geopolitics, for sure.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And you know what? We're taking you on a deep dive with this book.
Yeah.
We are going deep into the economic side of things today.
Right.
So this isn't just about, like, headlines, you know?
Yeah.
We're going deeper to understand the forces that are shaping the future.
Yeah, the future for everyone.
Exactly. Everyone's future. So the book starts with this quote, and it's from the economist Lawrence Summers.
Oh, okay.
And it's really interesting. He points out how significant it is that, like, USA Today,
Yeah.
USA Today, it's like this very mainstream newspaper.
Right.
They report every single morning on what's happening in Asian markets.
Interesting.
Like, that's how important this is. It's front page news.
Wow. Yeah, it just highlights how interconnected the entire global economy is with what's happening in Asia. What happens in the East has ripple effects everywhere.
Yeah, and this book does not shy away from the challenges either.
Nope.
It actually goes into how Southeast Asia especially got hit hard by the pandemic,
Yeah.
like really hard.
Really hard.
And the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS,
Yeah, CSIS.
they said it was actually a worse blow to that region than the Asian financial crisis back in the 90s.
Yeah, there's a reason for that.
Mm-hmm.
So the economies that make up the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN,
Right.
they're so reliant on global trade. They're just embedded in all these global supply chains.
Right.
Which meant when the pandemic hit and everything went haywire, they were incredibly vulnerable.
So, like, what did that actually look like on the ground?
So you've got Indonesia, a huge exporter of palm oil. That whole market was just thrown into chaos.
Wow.
Then you've got Malaysia, a big player in electronics manufacturing. Supply chains were disrupted, demand plummeted, and then Thailand, where tourism is a major part of their economy,
Right.
that just evaporated.
It's easy to forget how interconnected we all are, you know?
Yeah.
Reading about the tourism industry and their struggles, it's just like, wow, so many people's livelihoods depend on something as, like, unpredictable as global travel.
It's true. And it wasn't just the pandemic either.
Right.
You know, the U.S.-China trade war was already causing all this uncertainty.
Yeah.
So these economies were hit by both.
Oh, wow, a double whammy.
A double whammy. Yeah, and the usual safety nets, they just weren't there.
So 2020, bleak year for ASEAN.
Yeah.
But this book argues that there's a rebound coming.
Okay.
What's the reason for optimism? What are we missing?
Well, the book actually points to this kind of interesting contrast.
Yeah.
You've got the World Bank taking a very cautious view of the region, and then you've got the International Monetary Fund, the IMF being much more optimistic about their projections.
And that all comes down to China.
Yeah, in large part, it's all about how much weight each organization gives to China in their analysis.
So is that what makes the whole Asian century idea seem more believable? Like, even with those pandemic setbacks, China's growth is what makes Asia the place to keep an eye on.
Yeah, you could say that. There's this definite feeling that even with the pandemic, Asia is where things are happening. And a lot of that is driven by China's growth. But it gets even more interesting. The book talks about this idea of globalization 4.0. It's like a new phase where China's role is changing. They're not just the world's factory anymore churning out cheap stuff. It's more about domestic consumption now. And get this, outward investment, big time.
Hold on. So instead of made in China for us in the West, it'll be more like China's investing in stuff all over Asia. Infrastructure tech, like a rising tide.
That's the general idea. But, and this is important, they're not exactly playing by the old rule book. You know, they've got their own systems in place now. Things like the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB, basically these huge infrastructure and development projects and funds that are extending China's economic influence across Asia and beyond, really.
I gotta admit, when I was reading about the scale of some of these projects, it kind of blew my mind. We're talking trillions of dollars here, invested across dozens of countries. No wonder some countries are a little nervous. It's a huge power shift.
Exactly. And this plays into a bigger point the book makes about the U.S. and whether it's being left behind. While Asia is becoming more connected economically, especially with stuff like the BRI, the U.S. seems to be moving more towards isolationism. It makes you wonder in this whole Asian century idea, will the U.S. be a partner or will it get left behind?
That's the million-dollar question for sure. But let's get down to brass tacks here. Let's say someone's listening to us right now thinking, okay, should I be investing in Southeast Asia or what? What would you tell them?
It's not that simple, unfortunately. There's no easy answer. There are definitely still risks. geopolitical tensions for one. And then there's the issue of over-reliance on China. That's a big one. The book is optimistic overall, but it's not naive either. It acknowledges that there are no guarantees.
There's a lot to think about for sure. When I
Mm.
was reading this, one thing that really struck me was there's a lot to think about for sure. When I was reading this, one thing that really struck me was how the book talks about Asia's role in the world. It's not just about like economic power, it's about offering solutions.
Yeah, definitely. The author makes this point that Asian nations aren't just there to present problems for the rest of the world to solve. They're actually tackling some of these global challenges in ways that the West, frankly, could learn from.
Okay, see, that's interesting. What are they doing differently then?
Well, I give several examples. Sustainability is a big one. A lot of Asian countries are leading the way in things like renewable energy, green infrastructure. They're not just talking about it, they're actually doing it.
Hmm.
And then there's governance. There's a real emphasis on consensus-building thinking long-term, which is a stark contrast to, the short-term politically driven approaches you often see in the West.
That's an interesting point. It makes you think if the Asian century is really happening, is it really just about who has the biggest GDP or the most powerful companies? What if it's about something more? Like different values, different priorities?
It's a really thought-provoking idea.
Hmm.
It challenges a lot of assumptions about what global leadership should look like.
Yeah.
The book isn't saying one model is better than the other, but it does highlight how Asia might offer a different way forward. And that could reshape the world in some pretty big ways.
That's what I found so fascinating about it. It's not just some dry economic forecast. It's painting this picture of a different future, shaped by different ideas, different ways of doing things. It really got me thinking, what would it look like for Western countries to embrace some of these different approaches? How would we have to adapt?
That's a really good question.
Hmm.
One thing's for sure, things are changing. And the people and the countries that are ready to adapt, to learn from other perspectives, they're going to be in the best position to navigate this whole Asian century, whatever it ends up looking like.
Absolutely. Lots to think about. We've covered a lot from the impact of the pandemic to the rise of China to the possibility of a whole new kind of global leadership. If you're curious to learn more, and we think you should be, check out Cold War 2.0, Dawn of the Asian Millennium by Andranik Aghazarian. It's a really thought-provoking book that will get you thinking about the future that we're all creating together.